Well, Daniel Andrews, Greg Barber, welcome.
G'day.
Morning, Barry.
So we hear from Mark McGowan and John Robertson, your counterparts in New South Wales, they rule, and WA, they rule out ever forming an alliance with the Greens. What do you say?
Well, I'm interested in working hard over the next 2.5 years, Barry, to form a Labor government, not a Labor-Green government. And it'll be up to the Greens, if they've got representation in the parliament, to choose who they back, whether they back a Labor government or whether they keep Ted Baillieu in power.
But if you'd relied on their votes to form a government, you'd go for it, wouldn't you? You'd form an alliance?
I want to be very clear about this. No deal would be offered and no deal would be done. If Greg had votes in the Legislative Assembly, then he'd have to choose and justify to his voters the choice that he made, and that's what's so important. We've had a week now where the Green candidate in Melbourne won't rule out doing just that.
So it'll be short of the way it works. It'll be short of the way it works at the federal level. It'll be short of a formal alliance.
I think that's a very fair point to make, Barry. I'm not going to be signing anything.
Yeah, is that the way you think it'll work out, Greg?
Well, we've been in that position in many parliaments over many, many years, but what Daniel's offering is a recipe for instability. At the federal level, I think we've passed 336 of Julia Gillard's bills and opposed one. And I know from my experience in the parliament, including working with Daniel when he was Minister for Gaming and Health, that these things get dealt with in a cooperative fashion in the parliament.
Why then would John Robertson say that the reason he doesn't want an alliance is the Greens can't be trusted?
Or why would he? I mean, that's a question for him, I suppose.
What do you make of it, though? What's come over the Labor Party since that historic agreement?
I don't know, a bit of periodic navel-gazing, but in Victoria, of course, and with a by-election looming, there's some big issues there that have to be addressed. This is a booming inner-city neighbourhood with problems with public transport, with the planning system, major developments, lack of services for a growing population. Those are real issues, and the Greens have been addressing those over the last few weeks.
It'll be hard, though, won't it, Daniel Andrews, for the electorate to ignore this debate that's been going on now for a week or so, which means that it'll be hard for state issues to cut through.
Well, look, we're campaigning very hard on the ground, talking about cuts to TAFE, cuts to hospitals, cuts in schools. This is not a test of Julia Gillard's leadership, it's a test of Ted Baillieu's leadership, and what I'm asking Melbourne voters to do is to vote Labor and send a really strong message to Ted Baillieu that he's gone too far with these cuts.
But how can you send a message to Ted Baillieu when he's not in the race?
Well, indeed, and perhaps
you're sending a message to the Greens.
Well, this is the whole point, though, Barry. Taking a seat off Labor, voting for a minority party who have lots of unfunded and uncosted policies and will never have the majority to actually govern this state, that makes it easier for Ted Baillieu in 2014. Our key pitch, the ask of Melbourne voters, is that they stick with us so that we can put an end to these cutbacks and put a decent government back in this, get a decent government back as soon as we possibly can, Barry.
But rather than sitting there listening to that kind of message, he must be sitting back enjoying this. This is the two opposition parties as he sees it going at one another.
Well, look, Ted Baillieu didn't run, and I think there's probably a whole range of reasons for that. He'd like this to be a test of everything other than the fact that he's failed Victoria. But again, voters in Melbourne have a real chance to send Ted Baillieu a clear message, to stick with Labor and to make sure that we don't just have someone sitting on the sidelines, but that we have a real chance of making real history, and that's making Ted Baillieu the one-term Premier that he ought to be.
Greg Barber, do you think it'll be a difficult election to cut through in the last week on state issues, given the nature of the federal debate?
No, we're getting a lot of feedback from the voters that in Victoria it's the opposite of the federal death struggle. Down here it's just a political vacuum. Neither of the big parties are talking about the big issues. And if you're on a crowded tram every day, if your train's being cancelled, if some huge development's going up outside your window and you have no say on it, then that starts to drive your politics pretty strongly. And all you've got is Labor, who had 11 years. They blew it on those things. The Greens are putting forward some very positive policies in this election. So far, they haven't announced one policy, costed or uncosted. Our policies are out there. We've done 9 so far, 10 as of this morning. We're looking at extending trams later into the evening.
And how do you plan to introduce them, given that you'll be, even if you win the seat, you'll have one member in the lower house?
Well, Daniel's answered the question in terms of a fine balance in the parliament. He said basically he'll be the opposition leader and hand it over to Ted Baillieu rather than do a deal with the Greens to form a stable governing majority.
What do you say to that?
Well, the unfunded, uncosted policies with no opportunity to ever form a majority to actually deliver them don't benefit anybody, whether they're on a crowded tram or if you want a reason to vote Labor in the by-election next Saturday, Barry, have a look at the Herald Sun. The Herald Sun today shows that the Royal Children's Hospital built by Labor is not being properly funded by the Liberals, and thousands of kids are waiting longer than they should for the surgery they need. Now, the Greens won't fix that. Only Labor, who built the hospital, the party with no values that built the world's best children's hospital, not being funded properly by the Liberals, only the Labor Party can get rid of Ted Baillieu, not Greg, with all of his uncosted and unfunded promises. They're just words. Just words. No Conservative government's ever been unseated by voting Green, Barry, nor have any services been improved, nor have we got the sort of government we need by voting Green, a government that's about a stronger Victoria, but a fairer Victoria as well.
Is that one of the benefits of being with the Greens, is that you can, because you'll never have the prospect of governing, that nobody ever seriously pushes you to spell out your costings?
Well, same pitch there as Lindsay Tanner used to make, of course, in the federal seat of Melbourne before Adam Bandt won it for the Greens, and he's been able to deliver, I think, $500 million as a down payment on bringing dental into Medicare, and $10 billion for clean and renewable energy. Nobody thinks Labor would have done those things unless their deal with the Greens required them to start taking them seriously. So I've heard it before. The voters in Inner Melbourne have heard it before at the federal level, and the state seat, which is a subset of Adam Bandt's seat, is hearing the same message again. No policies from these guys, costed or uncosted. A whole series of quite modest but important policies rolled out by us with costings with each, by the way.
Modest would be one way of terming them. Public transport to everybody's door worth billions and billions of dollars is hardly modest, Greg.
What do you think the voters of Inner Melbourne thought when the Greens left the government high and dry on asylum seekers?
I think Labor and Liberal, in that case, got stuck with the politics, as they always do on asylum seekers.
You can't divorce the Greens from the politics either.
Of course you can't.
If you start with the politics of asylum seekers, just like they did in 2001 with the Tampa, you actually never get back to what the issue is, and that is a humanitarian issue of people running for their lives, seeking asylum here in Australia. And the Greens' approach, of course, is a humanitarian approach, and you understand how we voted the way we did in federal parliament.
Well, you say humanitarian. I'll just quote a letter that, in fact, Daniel Andrews quoted it in a newspaper column recently, but it was a letter to Adam Bandt on refusing to compromise, and it said, "You're maintaining a lily-white purity while people are dying."
Well, I'm a state MP dealing with those pragmatic issues of public transport and housing and so forth.
We can't have this, Barry.
Daniel, of course, wants to talk about asylum seekers because he doesn't want to talk about his policies.
We've just got a lecture from you about Adam Bandt and how he's a great reference to vote Green next Saturday. Greg used the term stuck with. What we got stuck with is the result of a political party with the balance of power who require everyone else to compromise except them. And that sort of purity, that sort of absolutism, means you don't get good outcomes. We had a chance to do not a perfect thing, but to do something that is absolutely and fundamentally better than the arrangement we have now. And the Greens said no to that. They stopped it, Barry. So I think whilst it's a federal issue and this is a state contest, and I'm happy to talk about state issues, but it was instructive, I think, to see just how impotent, just how this is all about blocking. It's all about asking others to do what the Greens won't do themselves, and that's live in the real world, make compromises without being compromised, Barry, and I think you can do that. But that was a very instructive period in the federal parliament, and I think it gives great reasons why people should be voting Labor and not Green. We don't want that being visited upon the state parliament.
And on the carbon tax as well, it's suggested that the Greens take but they don't give in terms of the final package.
The final package was a huge compromise on what the Greens would have liked to have seen, but it was a step forward rather than a step backwards, which is what Labor's refugee bill would have been.
So what do you think are the big differences, the ideological differences between Greens and Labor? Daniel Andrews, what separates them these days?
Well, what I know is that I understand that working people, and particularly people who do it tough, get no benefit. There's no opportunity, there's no empowerment in just words. You need costed policies, funded policies. You need to recognise that you can't do everything. You've got to make choices. If you don't live in the real world, having a holiday from reality does nothing for people, whether they're in the high-rise in the inner city or they're in Noble Park or other working-class suburbs. I'm about a practical agenda, a real agenda, and getting the consensus and the majority to be able to actually deliver it. That's what Labor stands for. This notion that you can promise everything to everyone and somehow that makes you a party of values, it's a fraud. It's not about values at all. It's about failure, talking instead of delivering. That doesn't benefit anyone, Barry.
Greg Barber, what do you think are the big differences?
Well, in this by-election, it's that he hasn't launched one single policy, costed or otherwise. And he's got a giant billboard on Flemington Road saying "Save TAFE," but he won't pin it down what "Save TAFE" means, and he won't put a dollar figure on it. So the Greens have got some practical policies
But
here.
that's narrowing it down to a by-election. What is the difference between the two parties? What makes a Green and what makes a Labor person?
Well, in our case, pragmatism. We're offering some policies that go to the day-to-day issues that people in this electorate are talking
I think the Greens
about.
are described as many things, Barry. Pragmatic would not be one of them. The key difference is that I'm about outcomes. I'm not about being a commentator. I'm not about sitting in the grandstand saying all the right things. I want to govern this state and I want to form a majority that can get things done for the people of this state. Taking a seat off Labor, one less seat, makes it harder for me to get rid of what has got to be one of the worst governments this state has ever seen.
But to bring it back to values, though, what are the differences in values? Sarah Hanson-Young says that that's the difference, that Labor hasn't got any values. What are the values that the Greens have that Labor seem to not have?
Well, our values are on display in a by-election where we've launched 10 policies, all of them costed, by the way. This is just something he keeps saying.
But that's things
Daniel's
like late-night
taking
trams
these-
and so on.
Daniel's taking these voters for granted. And of all places, the seat of Melbourne, the inner city of Melbourne, they're watching very carefully and analysing the different offerings of the different parties. And he thinks he can sail in on Ted Baillieu's a bad man, when Ted Baillieu on TAFE in many ways is finishing the work that the Brumby government started.
I think that's 3 times you've now asked Greg to say what his values are and what the differences are. The difference is this. The Labor Party is about fairness, it's about strength, it's about giving opportunities to people, it's about empowerment, but it's about being practical and living in the real world. It's not just about saying all the right things. My values are about delivering outcomes for working people who, without the support of government, never get the life opportunities that they are entitled to. That's what I'm all about. I can't believe 3 times you've now asked Greg to detail his values. The party of values, the party who would have Victorians believe that I don't have any values, can't say what they stand for, other than 9 unfunded, uncosted pipe dream policies.
Daniel,
You know, I don't have any of those policies, and I'm proud of it.
You don't have any policies at all.
Any unfunded, uncosted policies, Barry.
For you, this would be a nasty one to lose simply because you've held the seat for a century.
Well, look, this is a tough fight, and I've said it right from the moment that Bronwyn Pike left, and we don't take anything for granted. And I know it's a bit cliche, but we're going to be campaigning right up until the polls close and asking people to stick with us so that we can make Ted Baillieu a one-term premier, so that we can get those kids at the Children's Hospital the care they need, that we can make sure that TAFE doesn't get absolutely gutted. All of these things can only be achieved with a majority government, a Labor government, not a commentator sitting on the sidelines.
And what would it mean for the Greens to win this by-election in terms of the status of the party, not just in Victoria but nationally?
Well, I represent the area at the state upper house level. Adam Bant is the federal member for the area, and Cathy Oak in the lower house will be, if nothing else, a voice on issues that otherwise would not even be discussed. There is so much that Labor and Liberal agree on in the state parliament. The most common vote in the parliament is Greens on one side of the room, Labor and Liberal over there on the other. And I think the voters in Melbourne, particularly with Adam Bant, have seen what just one Green voice in the parliament can do.
Thank you both for being here this morning.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.